Okay, good evening, sisters and brothers. It's Brother Omowale again. Um, this is a continuation from a post I made yesterday, and this is to the critics who are trying to argue with me that there's no such thing as a slave trade in Africa, or slavery even, before the Europeans. So people ask me for sources. Yesterday, I did a video where I gave you a number of different sources that you could look at and material that I've been reading. It's kind of like it's supporting evidence in some cases. So what I'm going to share with you real quick is from this book right here. Somebody mentioned something to me about Dr. Diop, Sheikh Anta Diop. So I'm going to tell you or read to you what he says in this book, The Pre-Colonial Black Africa. Beginning, I believe this is on page 10 to page 11. All right, so check this out. He says, be that as it may, as evidenced by the preceding, there was a dual bond, religious and economic, which confined each individual within his caste, except in the case of the slave, who was not being a native, in reality belonged to a traditional lay category. Okay, what he's in here doing is, this is a section where he's talking about different caste societies. Because I've had even people come at me talking about there was no caste societies in Africa, which is way false. All right? Society had been conceived without taking his existence into account. He had been forcibly introduced into it. An intruder, a place was made for him somehow or other, without it assuming any religious significance. He was forcibly subjugated for nothing more nor less than economic, material reasons. Now he's talking about the status of the slave in ancient Egyptian society. No metaphysical concept later arose to justify his condition, as if to ease the consequences of the citizens. We shall see that it was otherwise in India for the pariahs and for the plebeians of antiquity, where the religious systems stipulated the impurity of these inferior classes. Next paragraph, check this out. In Africa, slaves belonged to a hierarchy. The social condition of the masters carried over to the slaves. Slaves of a nobleman were superior to those of a simple freeman and gave to the latter. And the latter, in turn, if the slave or ger, that's spelled G-E-R, would give to the slave of an artisan might own slaves once he was a gore. Once he was a gore. Now check that out. That's spelled G-O-R. That's going to be very important because notice something. He mentioned India in here. Nobles and clergy, traditional or Islamic, following the Almoravids movement of the 10th century, belong to the same caste and marry amongst themselves. In Africa, the nobility never acquired this keen sense of ownership of land. I'm going to read that again. In Africa, the nobility never acquired this keen sense of ownership of land. Alongside the conqueror, the king, there is in each village a poor old man in tatters, but respected in spirit, whom the spirit of the earth is considered to have entrusted with the land. Earth is a divinity. It will be sacrilege, actually, to appropriate any part of it. It only lends itself to our agricultural activity in order to make human life possible. Even during the Islamic period, up to the present day, this religious concept obscurely influences the consequences or the consciousness of all Africans, and it has contributed historically towards stopping or restraining tendencies to form a feudal system. The concept of privately owned land developed only among the Lebu of the Cape Verde Peninsula as a result of the development of the Great Port of Dakar after European penetration. Now, here's the thing that you guys not understanding here. When people blame colonialism or the Arab slave trade or slavery for altering the course of history in Africa and for the destruction of black civilization, it wasn't the slave system itself. Because my whole point is the slavery system began in ancient Egypt. It continued in the Kush. It continued in Ethiopia. Ethiopia flourished, had a flourishing slave trade. There's even in here where he talks about Mali and the class structure in Mali in the 1300s. African empires were built on slavery and the slave trade. Whether y'all want to realize that or not, here is the difference. The difference is, as African societies developed, they moved from a more tribal system, all right? They started becoming more urbanized. But the major difference with colonialism was you started having societies that were transforming internally, breaking down some of the class divisions, and you had more class divisions that developed with a merchant class that was emerging, not as slavery was intensifying or the slave trade was intensifying. Actually, what happened was the chiefs themselves started acquiring land. Africa transformed into a more feudal society with a primitive accumulation of lands. And the ruling classes started gaining private ownership of land. That was the major thrust of what started to transform African societies after the Europeans invaded and then started going into the colonial era. So those of you that said or was telling me all these arguments about how I need to read and there was no slavery in Africa, here's your source. Those of you that mentioned Dr. Diop to me, pick up this book, read it yourself, because there's something else in here. He mentioned the word ger, that's spelled G-E-R, or gore. Well, in some of my posts I've been sharing, what happened was, as the system started spreading, this African diaspora started spreading, Afro-Indian over into South India. The Ethiopian diaspora saw as Ethiopia and the East African coast became more maritime. And this, of course, accompanied the development of Islam, but not because of the Islam, not because of the slave trade. It had more to do with Africans migrating and controlling the seaports along East Africa, in Somalia, in Yemen, and over into the Calabar region of southern India. And they started controlling the caravan routes. Okay? They controlled the sea routes and the trading routes. And what happened was you had a series of Ethiopian, Kushite, Somali, Yemenite, Black Arabian saints and military leaders that established colonies in these areas. And one of them happened to be a man by the name of Baba Gore, who you need to read up on. All right? So, not only that, but what I'm going to hit you with, I've dropped some information already, but we need to look at these names. All right? You need to study the etymology of some of these names. What I haven't really shared with you guys yet is that in Ethiopia, there was up to the 1300s, there was a caste society. There was a group of as some societies change, there were in some areas groups of people that belonged to a caste that were known as the Geber, or the Gabar. All right, it's spelled Gobbar, or it's spelled Gebber. What I'm gonna break down to you one of these days is that class distinction, what the occupation was of this particular caste, the kind of labor that they did. And here's a hint. If you go back, you study ancient Egyptian or Kemetic mythology, who was the great cackler? Peace.